I want to talk a little bit about what I call core change. And don't forget, we're now in an extended intra-eclipse time that lasts about a month and a half. There were some comments yesterday in my blog about the effect of eclipses on the stock market. I'm sure they're valid, but I tend not to associate eclipse times with outer events, and I'll try to explain why. And I must comment that if eclipses could accurately predict the stock market, some folks would be rich, and perhaps they are. However, I have a different take on the effect eclipses bring, one that's more focused on, as I mentioned, inner changes rather than outer, and here it is. I'm not saying that there are no outer eclipse effects. Of course there are. But I tend to follow the Tibetan view that eclipses mark times when the inner subtle bodies, the chakras or whatever you want to call them, what are called the channels, the winds and the channels, all come together and clearly line up or align themselves within us at eclipse times. This alignment marks a change from these centers being unaligned, as they otherwise are much of the time. Perhaps we like to think that change precipitates sudden external events. But in my experience, that is only true if we neglect to respond to inner change with the appropriate measures. My experience with change, limited, of course, to my personal life, suggests that inner changes or inner realignment brings clarity, in which decisions can be made that only later will result or can be measured in the external. Now, I could be wrong in this, since I tend to focus inside more than outside anyway. I tend to associate deep inner change with intense solar events like solar flares and eclipses and various major astronomical events. Core change of this kind, for me, is more like setting or rearranging the sails on a boat so that you can take a different tack or approach. These inner adjustments that can be made, once they're made, eventually result, they do, and are going in an alternate direction. In other words, inner change marks a change in attitude or approach more than a sudden outside event. However, failure to note and adjust our attitude, to be aware, can result in physical consequences, of course, external events. The result of attitude changes on our part, changes in our approach, they may not be, or they're seldom evident all at once, but they gradually appear as the two courses, the old and the new, start to veer apart, the way we were and the way we can change ourselves to be. Eclipse changes, in my experience, become apparent down the road, over time. But they are, or they can be made right now, while the eclipse alignment holds, and while there's sufficient alignment and clarity to see how and what changes can or should be made. Of course, they're not just going to happen to us. We personally have to make them. No one else can do that for us, but failure on our parts to make adjustments to go along with change can sure affect us, right? The old adage is that a change at the core is worth more than any amount of change on the periphery. And the analogy that I hold close on this subject is that of a sphere. We can endlessly travel on the surface of a sphere like Earth, but we will never get any closer to the center. This is what the Tibetans call a relative truth. And it was something that my Dharma teacher explained to me many years ago in reference to the value of astrology. What Rinpoche said was that astrology is a relative truth. like the limbs on a tree. He said, the part of what he called the limbs of the yoga. But he says the root of the yoga was the Dharma. Now, of course, the Tibetans use astrology all the time, but even so, Rinpoche said that astrology, and I'm repeating, like all relative truths, can but help us get from here to there, just as we go from Detroit to New York on the Earth's surface. And this relative change may or may not be helpful. But regardless, it's only relative. By moving on the surface, we can perhaps improve our situation. That's the value of astrology, geomancy, tarot, and any number of other oracles. And it's not meant as a put-down. I'm an expert in astrology. After all, I've spent 50 years, most of my life, as an astrologer. And so certainly I value and use it all the time. But that being said, as I mentioned above, Rinpoche pointed out to me that astrology, and these are his words, was one of the limbs of the yoga, a relative truth. But he went on to say, it's not the root, it's not an absolute truth. Only the Dharma and its path lead inwards toward the center of the sphere and are not relative truths. They are absolute truths. So I love that analogy. From the center of a sphere, the entire surface can be viewed and is made practical. Yes, this is just an analogy, but in my opinion, a pretty good one. Now, getting back to these eclipse alignments, when they occur, that's when things start to free up, and we have the opportunity to actually make inner changes at a core, or at least toward the core level. And the results of those kind of changes can be much more powerful than just changing course at the surface. I don't want to push this analogy too far, but for me, it's been very, very useful. Change at the core level is not the same as change at the surface level. Eclipse alignments and intense solar activity, in my experience, allow for changes to be made at the core level. We can creatively take part in making these changes, or they can, and they will, they'll be made for us. Events can, and they will, overcome us if we are unable to act. In other words, what may appear as random outside events that impinge on us, that we're a victim of, are often just our own ignorance of and inability to be sensitive to the demands of interchange when they first arise, and then to work with and to make those changes work for us. Make any sense?